Thanks very much. We have time for questions. If you have a question, raise your hand, wait for the microphone, and then identify yourself and your affiliation, please. We can start right here.
Yes, I'm Sam Wright. I'm retired Navy. I understand that throughout the 7 decades plus of the Soviet era, there was a conscious policy to get ethnic Russians to settle in Georgia, Ukraine, the Baltic republics, and there's probably millions of those people and their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Is it possible for those people to be assimilated, or is there going to have to be a repatriation? Are the Putin's going to be doing Hitler-style, like with the Sudetens in Czechoslovakia? Is there a solution, or is this a problem we're going to be dealing with for many decades to come?
Well, I fundamentally don't believe in ethnic exceptionalism, which means, and by the way, what happened in Ukraine proved exactly my point, that what Putin really, the main strategic blunder that Putin committed for himself there, that before you had one big country in Europe that was mildly to saying skeptical about Russia historically, this was Poland. And now there's a bigger country, by the way, largest country in Europe, Ukraine, which got united around the idea that Russia is a long-term problem. Not just Putin, but Russia. And the issue is that many people in Ukraine who describe themselves as Russians became Ukrainian patriots within several months. I mean, it was built up for years and years, but it's really, you look at people in places like Mariupol or Odessa or some other place, you see amazing transformation. These people, many of them describe themselves as ethnic Russians before. But there are other issues. Putin is not looking for peoples to assimilate. Look at Abkhazia. Now basically Putin is taking steps to absorb Abkhazia into Russia's legal space, territory occupied of Georgia, but Abkhazia is emptied of people. Unfortunately, Georgian government, because it stopped to bother anybody in the West about this issue, now nobody wants to hear about this anymore, but they're signing an agreement which basically de facto will annex Abkhazia into Russia. But the way how they're annexing them, that the places they expelled 80% of pre-war population, and they would gladly expel also the others. They also make a problem, as well as I don't think they really want to keep in Crimea 2 million people. They want territories, but they don't want populations per se, and that's very important to understand, because also in Donetsk and Lugansk, those places are empty now. Most of the people in Donetsk never wanted to be under Russia. So this is kind of zones that are artificially created. And by the way, another worrying development is that now they're building a road from Russia state through Dagestan. Putin is spending $2.5 billion on a purely military road from Dagestan into Georgia and through Georgia to Azerbaijan. And this is, of course, road for double invasions of Georgia and of Azerbaijan, without any doubt. Because I don't know so far Putin, and some people are saying, oh no, he's doing it for economy. He never thinks in economic terms. Cato Institute notions are not really clear to acceptable to him. But in military terms, for sure, and he says it. At least he says it. He not only does it, he doesn't even conceal it. But of course, there's always wishful thinking. No, he wouldn't really do it. Well, if he prepares it, he will do it if he's allowed to. I would still think that because of these major blunders, he's in deep trouble, but it will get much worse before it gets better.
Two important lessons the world has learned from the Second World War, and those principles are engraved into international law. One is inviolability of borders, and second is treatment of national minorities as equal citizens of any countries, regardless where do they live. And most countries of the world actually do follow these principles, certainly with different levels, but just mostly of them follow these principles. And what is important that even some kind of national minorities living in other countries actually do understand it quite well and do accept these principles. In the case of Ukraine, for example, Mr. Putin and Kremlin are expecting that there will be so-called Russian Spring or whatever, Russian uprising in some kind of in support of secession or joining Russia and so on. And in fact of life, there is 8 million ethnic Russians living in Ukraine. The question is, how many people did support these subversive actions of the Russian special forces in East Ukraine? The highest estimate of these people who took weapons in their hands is 5,000. Out of 8 million ethnic Russians, I'm not talking about who Russian speaking, because a lot of Ukrainians are Russian speaking, but out of 8 million ethnic Russians, only 5,000 people somehow participating in this activity. Who is fighting them, those separatists, so kind of? Not only Ukrainians, many of them are Russians. If you look into this stuff on this kind of a personnel of these volunteer battalions in Ukraine, Donbass, Kramatorsk, Azov, Dnipro, all others, most of the people there are Russians, Russian-speaking and ethnic Russians. And if they are fighting separatists, they became very strong Ukrainian patriots. Why? Because they see the difference. They're producing two different political systems. Very harsh authoritarian and actually criminal, thuggish, that is presented by Kremlin, and not perfect, very far perfected, but nevertheless much more democratic, much more tolerant, and not so aggressive Ukrainian one. And among those two versions, most of them are choosing Ukrainian one because it's much more convenient, it's much more free. It's something that gives them promises of future for them and for their families. And that is why many Russians are fighting against this regime in Donbass, in eastern Ukraine. So that is why it's a creation, actually, of new Russian nations, of new free Russian nations on Ukrainian territory.
We'll take did you have a question? Yes. Take a question there, please. Could you raise your hand and identify yourself? Yeah.
Archil Gigashidze, Ambassador of Georgia. I have a remark, actually, not the question. Mr. President Saakashvili, with all my due respect to your personality, we know each other many, many years. I have to admit that I expected on your side more complete picture of what has happened and what's happening in and around Georgia. In your description, unfortunately, I saw a distorted picture of both the past and the present. Okay, of course, the transformation since 2003 have brought a major change in Georgia. The lights were on, streets were safe, and public services were clean from corruption. But as Oriental wisdom says, not everything that shines is gold. Unfortunately, this change was brought only due to a robust executive branch power at the expense of weakening checks and balances in democratic institutions, which at some point tempted this distorted power balance to abuse the power. And this is why the elections in 2012 ended as they ended.
Could I ask you to ask your question, please?
The question is that I would expect that you would explain why people would vote against you in 2012. You explained it because of feudal mentality, which is very humiliating to Georgians. Because of, mental backwardness of Georgians who cannot understand what is progressive and what is, advancing them to the higher standards of living.
Okay.
But in fact, what we saw was a style of governance which was unacceptable for Georgians.
We got the point. I'm asking everybody to make brief questions, as we have been asking everybody. So if that's your question, then let's give them a chance
I think
and give everybody else a chance.
I would
to ask
respond. I would respond with what Lee Kuan Yew said in his last book. He said that any successful governments, especially very successful ones, would be voted out from office in maximum 10 years in free elections because of the fact that people want to see change. And more successful governments are, more they will want to see the change. And then he added, that's why I never did free and fair elections in Singapore. Now, in Georgia, we did free and fair elections, and we gave people this choice, and people opted for something which would be better. Obviously, elections have cost, and my people, I'm very proud of Georgian people. When I talk about feudal mentality, I'm talking of feudal mentality of that corrupt elite, which is now back, unfortunately, in their majority, the helms of my society in my country. But obviously, I would not be sitting here, and I today did manifesto on Facebook to address Georgian people about our future programs, and I addressed it to my compatriots. I would not have been doing all that if I had not believed in the creative force of my people, because these reforms we did, these new places we built, I didn't do it with my own hands. I tried to let them believe they could do it, but they did it themselves, and I'm very proud of my people. Ambassador, I don't envy your position. We have several former ambassadors here in the hall, and they're much more free to speak their mind. That I really wish you that you'll come to a situation when you'll also be one day free to think what you say, what you think. But one thing I can say in the conclusion, you said not everything is gold that shines, but there is also another saying. Yeah, maybe not everything was gold that was shining under me in Georgia, but it was still shining, right? Something that applies to present situation now in Georgia is that if it looks like certain substance, if it smells like certain substance, that's it. And I don't know whether this smell bothers you, but it bothers certainly most of my compatriots already, according to every poll. People think their country is moving in the wrong direction overwhelmingly. And it bothers all the friends of Georgia outside, and you know it as well as I do because you are in this town. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Marian Tupi there, and then we'll take a question there. Why don't we gather two questions at once?
Thank you, Marian Tupi, Cato. From a practical policy standpoint, how important were international indices in guiding reform in Georgia? I mean, did you actually sit down the Minister of Interior and said to him, in 5 years' time, I want to be in position 50 on index X, or did it happen differently? How important were those things like TPI and Freedom House and so on?
No, they were very important. For me, one of the main first goals of my presidency was, because when I took over, Georgia was on partially a free category, and I wanted to put Georgia firmly under free category. And the last year of presidency, last year in my government, we went like just one grade, like 1 point below that, and it was our goal, but we almost got there. We went all the way up. And with benchmarks do matter for small countries. And they matter because we were FDI-driven economy. FDI went down 80% in Georgia. These are figures of this present government, which is not very good and disciplined usually with statistics, but even they said that. So in order to attract foreign investment, we had to do things, and we had to make country attractive. And we had 40% growth in tourism every year. This is the first year when we have 4% drop. After 40% of growth every year for the last 6 years, can you imagine? And for 5 years. And so it's the real statistics, but also benchmarks, which are even more telling, because how you represent your country. If you are, say, big Ukraine, because I am asked about Ukraine a lot here, if you are big Ukraine, you say, you can still, there are many Ukrainians out there in the world thinks. If you are a small Georgia, you need to have some visiting card because attention span is little. So for that, we needed to perform. And by the way, I'm sorry for abusing it, but I'm also asked questions from my library. I don't want to neglect them. And the point is that they also ask what we would share with Ukrainians on this corruption. It says we have a big group of people working in Ukraine with Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Economy, presidential administration. And I have to say that they introduced small things, but very important ones. Ukraine now has all the auctions are electronic. Huge breakthrough. Everything was before made falsified, and This was done by Georgian experts. Ukraine finally has a model of at least pilot projects, but already very important symbolically one, of public service halls to all the services under one roof, and it works 10 times faster, and of course it's cleaner, much cleaner than anything else in their government. So this experience is shareable. But still, I would not overestimate this thing, because I always kept telling Ukraine, you have to do the job. Don't listen to us maybe, but don't over-listen. Do your own stuff. And I think they will find the way.
Okay, right there. Could you raise your hand?
Oh, Sharon Bovat, Voice of a Moderate. Quick question. In the spring of 2013, it was revealed that the murder of Freddie Woodruff would have been, there were new things coming out, new revelations. Then in December, a relative of Freddie's, I believe it's right after you left in 2013, sent me an email saying they fear now with the change in control in the government, there will never be resolution or transparency in the death of that CIA agent who now has been made public. Do you have any comments about Freddie Woodruff? Thank you.
No, unfortunately, we tried to investigate to learn more. We couldn't really learn anything else than what you all know. I mean, I'm aware of that case because I was not at that moment in Georgia, but I was immediately thereafter, and it was still fresh. It was a painful thing for the Georgian government. That's all I can say.
Okay.
Even under Shevardnadze. Shevardnadze also, by the way, tried his best in that case. We know what we know.
Okay, last two questions. We'll take one here, right there, and then one up here. Yeah.
Peter Shutley, retired State Department. One of the major Chinese government analyses of the Soviet Union's collapse is it's important to maintain political control while you do the economic reforms. Don't do them simultaneously. Keep political control as long as you can and do the economic reforms first. My question to the panel is this sequencing or timing of political versus economic reforms. What's the right answer?
Okay, can we collect this, your question too, real quickly?
It's more brief comments, Krasan Stanchev.
Oh.
Looking at going back to Andrei, sorry. Looking at the Freedom House indices, I realized that when I was compiling, those for Bulgaria for 95, 96, it went down. But I know for sure who was compiling them before me and who was compiling them after me. So my point is, those things are really very subjective. I have my arguments, and those who were compiling them have their arguments. Comment number two. Recession and recovery is very important. But if you look at the successful, group of countries like Central Europe, they recovered after communism a bit slower than Germany after the World War II. So this is very important when you make the interpretation of all these things, so probably it's very important. Then recessions after these countries joined the European Union. This is also very different. So some countries, for example, Latvia, they did okay. But southern countries, Croatia, is a mess. Sorry.
I'm going to cut you off. Just summarize. I've asked everyone to just ask questions, so I'm not going to make an exception. This is something I learned on this panel.
All these needs, some more detailed explanation. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that.
All right. As for this comparison, political control over economic reforms, if you remember, I've shown several slides showing the group of countries in which political control has been kept with some economic reforms. Russia is one of the best examples. Political control has been kept by Corporation of Special Police, Political Police, KGB, FSB, almost all period of time, and some other countries like Uzbekistan, like Turkmenistan, they demonstrate the same approach. Keeping political control over the countries, they demonstrate the worst possible results of this transition, if it's possible to call the results. They're kind of a destruction of countries. Those countries that are able to move to political freedom, regardless how it is defined, so whatever, and who were able to to cut ties with the past as drastically as possible, as demonstrated examples of countries like Estonia, like Poland, like Albania, like Georgia tried it for a substantial period of time. So those countries achieve the most tremendous success. It's a kind of overwhelming results. As for Freedom House, okay, so just if somebody would produce better indicators of political freedom, I would really appreciate it. Just, but now, at this moment, it looks like it's what we can use. As for recession, okay, recession is very serious in all parts of this world. Unfortunately, in Russia, it's not like in Central Europe and so on. It was the largest recession of the last century. Actually, it happened to be even kind of it lasted longer, went deeper, and cumulative loss was larger than during the Second World War. In terms of even the kind of demographic losses, it's kind of a particular procedure to calculate how many people a country lost due to some kind of the extra mortality, the kind of extremely low birth rate due to all these mislocations, and so it's 11 to 12 million people. So it's a kind of almost half of those people who have died during the Second World War. That is a really unbelievable economic, demographic, social, and political catastrophe in the country. It should be understood. And that is why I would use this opportunity to kind of to address what my good friend Oleg Gavrilishin said in the early morning. He talked about Mr. Gaidar as the author of Big Bang. This is a very big mistake. It's a very big misconception. Mr. Gaidar was one of the authors of the greatest economic and political catastrophe in the country. He moved huge amount of wealth to political police, to KGB, to FSB, to Fidel Castro. He organized this hyperinflation. The reason is still unclear why he did it, but just his economic policy actually was an invitation to what happened after that and to what we have right now. So that is why just the result of what happened in Russia, and unfortunately in many other countries neighboring Russia, because Russia is a very influential country, and what's happening in Russia influencing events in other countries. It's a result not of economic reform or democratic reform, or political reform. It's a result of a particular design to destroy the country and to bring some kind of particular group of people, corporation of political police to top of the power. And he succeeded in this. But this is a very different category. It's not an economic or political reformers who brought any country freedom. It was absolutely in different direction.
Dalibor, did you want to say something?
If I could just make a brief point about the sequencing. I think it is indicative that the report you mentioned comes from China, and I'm saying that because it really depends on the perspective of who is thinking about the sequencing. If you are on the standing committee of the Communist Party, you probably don't want to lose political control. But for people in Central and Eastern Europe, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, political liberalization was one of the low-hanging fruits. It was one of the easy things that could have been done immediately. And it was indeed done in the more successful countries immediately and had lasting effects. The point I would like to make is that that early political liberalization and economic reforms seem to be mutually reinforcing. So for political pluralism and democracy to stick, people need to see that the new political system can deliver the goods on sort of the material side, and therefore, I don't really see many cases. I mean, I don't see any cases of successful transitions on the economic side that would not involve political liberalization in the sort of post-Soviet space. There just aren't any.
Anything else?
Well, on political versus economic power, I think this is a little bit artificial because the main thing that needs to be done for successful transformation is to decouple purely political interest in the economy. That's the key. And then also democratically elected leaders can do it in free societies if they really have strong will to do it. and not to have this merger of political interest manipulation or party financing for concrete elections with concrete economic processes. And this could be achieved. This was achieved by Pinochet, but through other means. And this can be achieved. This was achieved by us in the democratic society. So you can have both models, but in long run, of course, democracy is much more sustainable, because then the dictatorship or authoritarian regimes leave lots of scars behind. That's very important to understand. So from that standpoint, I still believe free societies can do it. The point is, of course, it's not sustainable. I mean, it cannot do it forever. There is no elected government that can last forever, which is our example clearly demonstrated. But at least the time period that allocated, it can be done efficiently, and if there is a continuity, then it will be picked up. Or if it's not picked by next government, at least people will remember how it looked, and they'll force any future administration to do it. And I think that's what will happen in Georgia.
Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time. I want to thank all of you for joining us, and I want to ask you to thank our speakers for their excellent insights today.